grab your beverages and turn up your interweb. It's time for the Dudes and Beer Fantasy Football Podcast.
Fantasy freaks and geeks, what is up? This is the Week 15 edition of the Dudes and Beer Fantasy Football Podcast. Thank you for joining me here. I'm Matt McPeek. I'm riding solo this week. The other guys had some business affairs to tend to, but it's all good. I'm going to get you guys ready for this second to last week of the fantasy season. I can't believe it's almost done here. For some of you that play in 3-week playoff leagues, you're already in week 2 of your playoffs, and for the most of you that are in 10-team leagues that you only have those 2 weeks of playoffs, this is the first week of the playoffs, so this is a huge week here. We got, for this part 1, we're going to be doing the Thursday game and the 2 Saturday games. So this week we got 3 games that are before Sunday, so you really got to make sure you have your lineup set and stay on top of it throughout the weekend. Make sure you're not starting dudes that are going to be sitting. There's a lot of guys that are questionable going into this week, so it's going to be a big week for injuries. And then to finish up part 1, we're going to do the 3 AFC West and AFC North games. And then in part 2, we're going to move on and do the 3 NFC North versus AFC East games. We got 3 NFC East versus AFC South games, and we'll finish up with the 4 NFC West and NFC South games. But before we get to all that good stuff, we're going to start with our cheers and pours. This past week was pretty crazy. We saw some huge fantasy numbers coming from some maybe one surprising guy, maybe 2 guys that aren't so surprising. And the first cheers goes to Derrick Henry, 238 yards with 4 touchdowns. I think he stiff-armed about half the defense on that run. The 99-yard run was pretty ridiculous. It seemed like to me the Jaguars have quit to let a 200-plus pound running back run 99 yards down the field and stiff arm half your defense. Looked like they gave up to me. The next one is Amari Cooper. He also had a massive game, 217 receiving yards, 3 touchdowns. Yeah, all the Eagle fans around here were quick to remind me that he did it up against 4th-string cornerbacks, but doesn't matter to us. Fantasy points are fantasy points. The next big, huge number that we saw was from George Kittle, 210 yards and a touchdown from your tight end. Pretty ridiculous. If you heard any of the sound bites after the game, he was 5 yards short of the single-game record for receiving yards for a tight end. The head coach there, Shanahan, was saying that he was sick for not getting him that other 5 yards, and I would be too. I feel bad. The guy's he's been probably the most reliable player for them all season for the 49ers there. So cheers to those 3 players with those 3 huge games. The next one here is Kenyon Drake, who's gotten a lot of flack on this podcast, whether from me or from Adam or for Paul. He scored on that crazy last play, 3 or 4 different laterals to beat the Patriots down in Miami in Week 14. He had 14.5 fantasy points, which isn't crazy, but I mean, just the way that game ended, the dude's going to remember that for the rest of his life, and I'm sure a lot of Dolphins fans will remember that for sure. The next guy I'm cheersing to here is Zeke Elliott. He's just a beast. He had 40 touches last week. I caught 12 passes, had about 200 total yards. It was just ridiculous. He is the heart and soul of that team. I feel like it's they go as Zeke goes, and he goes a lot. So my next cheers is to Cameron Brate. He only caught 2 passes, but if you keep looking on down the stat sheet, you'll see that they were both for a touchdown. So, 2 touchdowns from a tight end, even if they were only for 1 yard each, you're getting good points there for a tight end. 2 touchdowns, I'll take that any week. And then the last guy I'm cheersing to is really a whole group of guys. It's the Bears DST. Last week they played the high-powered Rams offense, and they racked up 3 sacks, 4 interceptions, a safety, and they allowed the combination of Goff and Gurley to 238 yards between the two of them. So Goff's passing yards and Gurley's rushing and receiving yards, 238, which is the lowest yards that they've been held to all year. So, we don't ever really give love to any DSTs here, especially in the cheers and the pours. But I'm sure there's plenty of fantasy owners out there who, if the last week was the first week of their playoffs, who they probably won just because they had a defense give them 20-something points. So those huge numbers from defenses can really slingshot your team ahead of somebody. So cheers to all of the Bears defenders. They played awesome, keeping the Saints to freaking 6 points. That's ridiculous. And speaking of Saints not the Saints. It was the Rams that they held to under 6 points. And speaking of Rams that underperformed, Todd Gurley held to just 58 total yards, less than 10 points for the first time this season. Even the game that he left early against the Chiefs, he didn't leave early, but he just his production went completely down. He still played better in that game than this past game. So definitely pouring one out for you, Todd. Anybody who has Todd Gurley in their lineup, if you're in the playoffs, you probably have a first round bye anyway. But he definitely underperformed, and I'm sure there's plenty of fantasy owners out there who lost the first week of their playoffs, and they're looking at that that 6 points from Todd Gurley and saying, damn, how did I lose with the best running back in fantasy? But that happens, man. It's fantasy football. My next pour is going out to the combo of James White and Sonny Michel. They were on my pour one out last week, and they're on here again. The two of them were held to under 100 yards combined. It was a great matchup against the Dolphins last week, and they just didn't perform, getting vultured by both Burkhead and Devlin. The fullback comes in, snipes another touchdown from whoever should have gotten that. I'd say it was probably Sonny Michel's touchdown to get, but the Patriots don't play like that. So we're moving on to the next pour one out, which is Russell Wilson. 75 pass yards at home in a primetime game. By far the worst game of the year for him. He was saved by his long run that he had in the fourth quarter, which we'll get into when we preview that Seahawks game. But just a horrible game for him. But he wins. That's all that matters to him. So I'm also pouring one out here for Zach Ertz. Only gave you 6.5 points, even in a half PPR league. Which isn't absolutely horrible for a tight end. I mean, for a lot of tight ends, you'd take that, but Zach Ertz is different. You're not counting on him as a tight end. You draft him as, the number one receiver that he's targeted as. You're counting on him for that production, and he just did not give it to you last week. So another bummer in the for what is for a lot of people that are in leagues that are either 12-team leagues or it's a 10-team where 6 teams get in. You have 3 weeks of playoffs here. It's another huge bust in probably some playoff matchups here, but that's how it goes. He is still a tight end after all. And the last pour one out is going to a group of wide receivers that were in awesome situations in Week 14 as far as what target share they should have gotten. You look at Cortland Sutton after Manny Sanders goes down, and Demaryius Thomas has been gone for a couple weeks, and Cortland Sutton becomes the de facto number one target there, and he gives you 14 yards on 2 catches with 6 targets. Just horrible. Kenny Galladay was even worse. Two catches on his 4 targets for 5 yards. The Tate trade, Marvin Jones goes down. No Kerryon Johnson last week. It looked like it was going to be a funnel target game to Kenny Galladay, and it just did not happen that way. And even the 2 catches that he got, he gave you 5 yards. Just horrible. And then the last one, which was the worst catch rate of all of them, was Chris Godwin's 1 catch on 10 targets for 13 yards. Deshaun Jackson wasn't there. he just completely underperformed. He absolutely killed me last week in my Fanduel lineup. I think I might have cashed out on that one if it wasn't for Chris Godwin's horrible play, but we're going to move on from him, pour one out for sure. And as we take a quick moment here for me to take a sip of beer. It's a weird concept when the podcast stops for a couple seconds while I take a sip of beer, but I'm sorry. It is the Dudes and Beer podcast. Again, real quick, before we get into the Thursday game, I'm just going to run down my my DFS, my FanDuel lineup here, which I'm pretty excited about this week. There's a lot of injury concerns with quite a few players, which always opens the door to getting guys on your lineup that should outproduce what their value is, that should give you, that should get more opportunity with guys out. So the first one I'm going with is Jared Goff. He's the 11th most expensive quarterback, 7,900 versus this Eagles defense. We just saw Amari Cooper rip him up. They're still dealing with a lot of injuries there in the secondary, and I'm looking for Goff to have a bounce back game at home. For running back, I'm going with Zeke Elliott for 8,800. It's a lot, but he gets to play inside at the Colts. Indy allows the second most receptions and the sixth most receiving yards to running backs, and we just saw Zeke Elliott catch 12 passes last week. So I think you can bank on him getting his normal 75 to 100 yards rushing plus, what we all know he's capable of doing in the pass game against this in what is a great matchup as far as Indy versus pass catching running backs. My next running back is Dalvin Cook, who's actually pretty cheap. $6,200. He's playing the Dolphins. The Dolphins run defense is really bad despite the Patriots defense, despite the Patriots running backs not really putting up any big numbers last week. But the Vikings did just fire their offensive coordinator, John DeFilippo. The head coach Zimmerman out there wants to run the ball more, and we have seen Cook get more attempts last week than he had pretty much all season. I think we can say that over these next couple weeks, we're going to see those carries go up. We're going to see his involvement go up, and his usage in the pass game helps raise his floor for sure. So again, FanDuel is a PPR format, so I'm playing Dalvin Cook for sure. I'm hoping that, we see his carries upwards around 15 to 16, maybe 4 or 5 catches, get him more involved, which is what the head coach wants. So at wide receiver, I'm going with DeAndre Hopkins. He's a beast, $8,600. He's worth it, just like Zeke. He's playing the Jets. Jets allow 6 most fantasy points to wide receivers. It's just it's too good of a matchup to pass up with an elite wide receiver like this. Another elite wide receiver for sure is T.Y. Hilton. He's 7,900 on the cheaper side of what I consider the elite wide receiver. He's playing the Cowboys, not the greatest matchup, but he's averaging 11 targets and 110 yards over the past 4 games. Andrew Luck's on fire. They have a definite connection there. So I'm riding with T.Y. Hilton this week in my wide receiver 2. And the third wide receiver I'm going for, this is kind of what I was mentioning earlier before I started this lineup here, was guys that are going down, that are questionable going into this week. It is Wednesday night as I'm sitting here recording, and Tyreek Hill is still questionable. Don't know if he's going to play tomorrow night, and if he's out, I'm starting Chris Conley for sure. It's $4,700. They're playing the Chargers at home, Thursday night football. It's such a great value for a guy that would become the number 1 receiver in what is the most explosive and best offense in football. You got Patrick Mahomes throwing you the ball. You can pretty much count on some production out of him if he's going to be targeted and if he's going to be used as the number 1 receiver. We don't have Kareem Hunt anymore, so I don't think that the Chiefs would go to a run-heavy game script just because Ty Hill's out. I think they would more than willingly be able to use Conley and Travis Kelce the same way they maybe not the same way, but they can definitely get some production out of him. So $4,700 for a receiver like that, I'm riding with him. If Ty Hill does play, I'll just pull him out, and I still have like $800 or $900 to play with, which means I can still put in Pettis from the 49ers, who's had a couple good weeks in a row, or I like Randall Cobb also this week. The two of them have pretty low value, and I'll get into why I like Randall Cobb when we do the Packers preview. He's got a pretty interesting matchup for sure. At tight end, I'm going Jared Cook, $6,300. He's playing the Bengals. Bengals are really bad on defense against everybody. The Raiders have a pretty bad receiving core. They're, we just saw Jordy Nelson. I think he had 10 or 11 targets last week, something ridiculous. So Jared Cook is definitely the number one receiver, number one option there. He's given you number one receiver production at the tight end spot, averaging 8 targets a game over the past 5 games, and he's got this great matchup. So I'm willing to pay up. One of those, the lower of the most expensive tight ends, but I think it's definitely worth it. And then in my flex, I'm going with Jalen Samuels, $5,500 versus the Patriots. Again, this is a guy that I'm only going to start if James Conner is out. So I'm just going to have to keep an eye on that lineup. And if Sunday morning rolls around and I see that he's out, I'm just going to, switch him out for somebody else. That's why I'm going to keep him in my flex spot. That way I have some flexibility to, play a wide receiver there instead if I wanted. And the defense I'm going with is the Rams this week, $3,800 playing the Eagles. There's a report out today from, I think it was CBS. Carson Wentz will reportedly miss this game, and they might even shut him down for the rest of the season, depending on whether or not they're still in playoff contention or not. So this Rams defense coming off of a lackluster performance last week for $3,800 against a backup quarterback, even though it is a backup quarterback that won the Super Bowl MVP last year in Nick Foles. But we'll see. We'll see what happens there. We're going to move on now to our Thursday night preview. We got the Los Angeles Chargers coming off of a win, playing the Chiefs, who also won last week against the Ravens in what was an awesome game to watch. Went into overtime. It was fantastic. It starts in this game. Obviously, it's Rivers and Mahomes. I heard a stat from CBS earlier today. Philip Rivers, in his past 4 games against the Chiefs in Arrowhead, he has 2 touchdowns and 6 interceptions. Not that great. But if we have no Melvin Gordon again, and if it's already Austin Eckler's already been pronounced out, so it might just be Justin Jackson at running back. If that's the case, Rivers is going to throw the ball so much. I think you kind of have to play him. This Chiefs defense gives up the 5th most fantasy points to quarterbacks, so I'm definitely playing both quarterbacks. If Melvin Gordon is playing, I'm playing him. If not, I'm playing Justin Jackson if I can. Chiefs are also giving up the 2nd most fantasy points to running back. So whichever running back is going to play this week, he's got a good matchup. I think if Melvin Gordon doesn't play, I don't know if I'd feel comfortable playing Justin Jackson. But if Melvin Gordon does play, I think I might stay away from Justin Jackson. But if Gordon doesn't play, then I'm all for Justin Jackson for sure. And then obviously you're playing Keenan Allen. He's a beast. Him and Rivers have been on a tear lately. I think it's 4 or 5 games in a row now. Keenan Allen with a touchdown. He's had this string of good matchups, and he's taken advantage of it. The starts for the Chiefs, obviously, if Ty Hill is playing, I think you can put him in there. Yeah, you got to be worried that he might leave after a couple drives or even after the first play if maybe he's not feeling well. But the chance that you have of another 139-yard game with 2-3 touchdowns like he's had in the past, it's just he's just so hit or miss, and those hits can be so huge that I feel like you kind of have to play him. You've had him in your lineup all season. It's the playoffs. Yeah, I understand if he's questionable going into the game, those concerns, but to me, if he's playing, I'm playing him. And then, like I said, Travis Kelce is a must start at tight end, no matter what the matchup is. And it's not a good matchup, but it's not a bad matchup either. So the only other one here is Chris Conley. If Tyreek Hill misses, I think you can play him. Sammy Watkins is probably going to miss again. I don't know whether or not Kelvin Benjamin, who they traded for last week, whether or not he's even going to be active or if he's even going to be counted on for any significant role. Maybe they'll feel forced to use him if Ty Hill is out, but we'll have to keep an eye on that. If Benjamin comes out and has a monster game, I'm not going to be upset about it. You can't take that risk playing. That dude wasn't active last week. We don't know how much of the game plan he even knows yet. So I'm staying away from him. And just real quick, looking at the Chargers numbers here against the Chiefs the last time they played. Keenan Allen had over 100 yards and a touchdown. Melvin Gordon had over 160 total yards. Austin Eckler had over 100 yards. So, like I said, whichever running back's going to play, I'm playing him against the Chiefs, and Keenan Allen is a must-start to me no matter what. The next game here is the Texans and the Jets playing in New York. Looks to be a good game for these Texans. Deshaun Watson's probably going to eat him up. Hasn't been playing, at a MVP level, but he hasn't been playing bad at all. He's giving you that nice rushing floor every week. Last week he had 35 yards on 5 carries, 267 pass yards with a touchdown. So he's hitting on that floor every week. Lamar Miller, 14 carries last week for only 33 yards, but he did get you the touchdown. I'm starting him against this Jets D. They're middle of the pack against the running backs, but the carries that Lamar Miller's is getting, you can't really get away from it. He was also targeted 6 times last week, caught 5 of them. So he's being used for sure. And then, like I said, DeAndre Hopkins is a must start. And I think you can play Demaryius Thomas in this matchup as well. Last week only had 6 targets, but that's probably to be expected, 5 to 6 targets a game. Maybe you can see it get up to 8. This Jets defense gives up the 8th most fantasy points to wide receivers, so it's a good matchup for all of them. Looking at the Jets, I'm not starting anybody on this team. I think maybe if you're really hurting at tight end, if you're maybe the guy who's been riding with Cam Brate, and you see he's got that matchup against the Ravens this week, maybe you can get away with playing Chris Herndon. The Texans are in the top 10 for most fantasy points allowed to tight end, so maybe. But I think I'm staying away from all these Jets players, especially all these running backs. Apparently today on Wednesday, not one of them practiced, and Crowell was in a walking boot. So beware of that for all you New York Jet RB owners out there in the fantasy world. Next game we got is the Browns at the Broncos. Baker Mayfield's been up and down kind of this season, but last week played pretty well. 18 completions, 240 yards with a touchdown. Hasn't really done anything with his legs this year, which is a little surprising. I was kind of expecting him to, maybe be a little more of a scrambler, but he hasn't really done that. He's sitting back there in the pocket, which I'm sure those Browns coaches love to see. Nick Chubb, I'm definitely starting him for sure. He's been their bell cow over these past 2 weeks. Kind of seen his touches go down a little bit, but I think they kind of go back to him in what's probably going to be a cold game up there in Denver. So definitely starting Nick Chubb. And then we saw Jarvis Landry kind of have a rebirth, if you will, almost last week. He's been getting the same targets, got those 4 targets last week, but he caught 3 of them for 60 yards and a touchdown. Then he also had 2 carries. One of them was a 51-yard touchdown. So they're figuring out ways to get him the ball, and he produced for him last week at least. So maybe they stick with that and keep getting him. You got to get this guy the ball, in my opinion, at least 10 times a game, whether it's on sweeps and jet, all these weird things we're seeing from the NFL, or, just target him like he had been his whole career. And then also I'm starting David Njoku in this matchup. Broncos give up the 4th most fantasy points to tight ends. We saw Njoku was targeted 4 times last week. I think we see his targets go up a little bit this week. And then all these wide receivers that the Browns have besides Jarvis Landry, I'm staying away from all of them. None of them are being used enough to warrant a start for me. For the Broncos, to me, it's pretty much just Phillip Lindsay. he's been a beast. He's been great. Last week he only had like 50 total yards, but he did get you a touchdown. Touched the ball 18 times, which is a lot considering how many touches he's gotten throughout the season here. And then the other one that, if you really want to take the chance, fire him up again, is Courtland Sutton. Again, he's in this great situation. Not a bad matchup here against the Browns, but he's got to do more than 2 catches on 6 targets. He has the chance to prove to John Elway and the rest of the coaching staff there in Denver that he can be a number 1 wide receiver, that they don't need to go out and draft another guy, that they're bringing somebody from free agency. We saw this other young receiver, Deshaun Hamilton, last week. He caught 7 of his 9 targets for 50 yards and a touchdown. So, we got to see production like that from Courtland Sutton. So I'm staying away from him, but if you had to start him in your flex, I can understand. Another game here, the Raiders at the Bengals, 2 really bad defenses. I'm starting Derek Carr in this one. Last week he had over 300 pass yards with 2 touchdowns. Jared Cook is the number 1 there. He's the guy who's getting the targets. He's catching the ball. He's the most involved. He's getting the red zone looks. Caught 7 of his 10 targets last week for 116 yards. Would have loved to see him get in the end zone there, but you'll take those 100-yard games by tight ends for sure. The Bengals are giving up the most fantasy points to running backs, and they also give up the most receiving yards to running backs. So I think you can definitely play Doug Martin or Jalen Richard this week, especially Jalen Richard in a PPR league. Last week we saw him only get targeted 1 time, but I'm sure that John Gruden's going to look at this matchup and see how bad the Bengals are at covering running backs out of the backfield, and they're going to use the talent that they have, and Jalen Richard is one of the best running backs at catching the ball out of the backfield, so I expect a big game from him. And then looking at the Bengals, another running back that has a great matchup here. Raiders give up the 7th most fantasy points, and Joe Mixon last week, we saw him with over 30 touches, over 130 total yards with a touchdown. Man, was I wrong. I thought that he was going to kind of get shut down considering the fact that the Bengals were starting a backup quarterback. They didn't have A.J. Green there, but it was the complete opposite. They just ran the entire offense through Mixon, and the Chargers could do nothing about it. Their run defense over there in Los Angeles is not all that great for either team, really, but especially the Chargers. Mixon really chewed them up last week. I'm staying away from the rest of the Bengals offense. The one guy that's kind of interesting to me here is John Ross. He caught 2 of his 4 targets for only 11 yards, but a touchdown last week. Probably not somebody very many people were expecting to be a red zone threat, but he's got 6 touchdowns on the season, 18 receptions, and out of 43 targets. That's a pretty good catch rate, a pretty good touchdown rate. 6 touchdowns on 18 catches. So, I mean, considering this Raiders defense is not all that great, if you really, in a 12-team league and you're looking at some of the guys on your bench and not feeling all that great about it, maybe you can take a flyer on John Ross there. Moving on to the Buccaneers playing at the Ravens. This is one of the worst defenses playing one of the best defenses. The Bucs are in the top 7 in fantasy points allowed to every position. We're looking at Jameis Winston last week. He threw his first interception in a couple games. He's another one of these mobile quarterbacks that gives you a nice floor with his rushing. 47 rushing yards last week. 213 passing yards. Not a bad game, but I'm not starting him against this Ravens defense, giving up the 3rd fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks. Peyton Barber's been way too inconsistent. Ravens, they give up the fewest fantasy points to both running backs and wide receivers. So I'm staying away from Peyton Barber. I'm staying away from Chris Godwin after that horrible game for him last week, and also Adam Humphries, who's come on over this past couple weeks, been very much involved in the Buccaneers pass offense, but I'm staying away from him too. I think the only guy you can really play for this Buccaneers offense is Mike Evans, just because he's one of these top tier wide receivers. He's kind of been more of a wide receiver 2 this year than a 1, I think, as far as fantasy goes. But, there's a lot of guys out there that are in the playoffs and they need him. So you're starting him. And then again, if there is a weakness for the Ravens, it's the one thing that they don't do great. We saw Kelsey eat him up last week. So maybe you can count on Cam Brate for another 2 touchdown game, but I'm not counting on it. I have him in one of my leagues that I'm in the playoffs, and I'm actually sitting him for. I picked up somebody off the waiver wire. I forget who it was. Oh, I think it's a thin pick in that league, but I think I picked up Dallas Goedert with the Eagles. We saw him get absolutely hosed on a horrible pass interference call that would have been a touchdown for him. He would have had a really nice game. He's been a lot more involved over these past couple of weeks as we've seen Ertz's numbers kind of come down a little bit. They're definitely getting the other tight end a little more involved, so I'm taking a flyer on him over Cam Brate playing in this matchup against the Ravens. For the Ravens offense, Lamar Jackson has been pronounced the starter with Joe Flacco being named healthy enough to play here, but he's going to play. Lamar Jackson. He's given you 70 rush yards at least 70 rush yards in the past 4 games, with at least 150 pass yards, or averaging 150 pass yards over those 4 games. To me, that's just a beautiful floor. That's a floor of 14 points right there, not counting not counting any touchdowns. So you're getting 14 points out of his yardage. If he scores a rushing touchdown, he's getting you to 20 points. If he scores at least one passing touchdown, he's getting you to 24, 25 fantasy points. He's great. I think in my my zero RB league, for all of you that have been keeping up with my zero RB league, I got Aaron Rodgers. I'm in the playoffs. It's a 12-team league, so it's a 3-week playoff. I won last week, and now I'm in the semifinals here. I'm playing. I have Aaron Rodgers and I have Lamar Jackson on my bench, and I'm very much considering playing Lamar Jackson over Aaron Rodgers because he's got the Bears, which is a horrible matchup. So we'll get into that in part 2. But yeah, I mean, Lamar Jackson's definitely playable here in Week 15. Like I said, those rushing yards are just they're too much of a boost to your floor to avoid. Gus Edwards, I think we can still roll with him. Kind of a disappointing game, only 67 yards on his 16 carries last week. He's not involved in the pass game whatsoever. But I mean, you look at the guy that is involved in their pass game, Ty Montgomery. He got 3 touches last week and gave us 2 yards. So I don't know if they can really, keep doing this. There's a reason why the Packers let him go for a 7th round pick. And then we saw Kenneth Dixon come in and vulture a touchdown from Gus Edwards. He got 8 carries and had 60 yards himself, almost the same yardage on half the carries. Not great, but that offense is looking good. And in this game that we would assume the Ravens are gonna get up fairly early on this horrible Bucs defense. And they're just going to sit back with their awesome defense and let Jameis Winston turn the ball over. And I see them really running the ball all game. So I'm riding with Edwards this week for sure. In our last game here for the Week 1 preview, we got the Patriots coming off of that devastating last play of the game loss to the Dolphins, and the Steelers coming off of a weird loss to the Raiders where Big Ben left the game with an injury. He came back, was sitting on the sidelines. We saw Josh Dobbs come in the game. He threw an interception. They went down, and Big Ben came back into the game and tried to rally for a victory, but they were unable to do so. So I'm playing Big Ben this week. It's at home. It should be a huge game against this Patriots team. Could decide playoff seeding for sure. I'm rolling with Big Ben. He's had a pretty awesome season this year, so I'm rolling with him. I'm rolling with Jalen Samuels. If James Conner is out again, I think we can safely say he'll get another 18 to 20 carries 18 to 20 touches like he got last week last week with 11 carries, only 28 yards, but he did catch 7 of his 7 targets for 64 yards. Would have loved to see him get that touchdown carry that Stephen Ridley came in and sniped from him, but we'll take that production, I guess, in a PPR league. And quick note that the Pats do allow the 5th most receptions and the 6th most receiving yards to running backs. So that does fare well for Jalen Samuels if James Conner misses. I'm not playing Stephen Ridley. He only got to 5 touches last week. Yeah, he did get that touchdown, the goal line carry, but I think in the playoffs, there's certain guys you can take risks on, and Stephen Ridley is not one of them to me. Antonio Brown, disappointing game last week. Another one of these dudes who, was probably helped a lot of people get to the playoffs and then gave you a stinker. Caught 5 of 7 targets for 35 yards. Huge disappointment, but it is Antonio Brown. He'll bounce back. Juju Smith-Schuster, on the other hand, did not have a bad game. He had quite the good game. Caught 8 of his 12 targets for 130 yards and 2 touchdowns. He looked great. He has looked great all season. I think we're going to be talking about him vaulting his way into the fringe, or the fringe wide receiver 1, wide receiver 2 combo or conversation next year. These 2 tight ends, I'm staying away from them. The matchup against the Pats isn't great, but it's not bad either. So, 4 targets for McDonald, 2 targets for James. Each gave you under 40 yards, so I'm staying away from them. For the Patriots, I think you kind of have to start Tom Brady. Was kind of playing not bad, but not great over the past couple weeks. But then last week he gave you 350 yards with 3 touchdowns. So definitely rewarded all those patient people out there, with Tom Brady owners out there. The Steelers do give up the 8th fewest fantasy points to running backs. I don't think you can really get away from Sonny Michel, but I think you might be able to get away from James White. I'm sure a lot of people have been counting on him throughout the season, but over these past couple weeks, as we've seen Rex Burkhead return, and we've seen James Devlin emerge as their goal line back, I think you might have to sit James White. The Steelers not only give up, as I said, the 8th fewest fantasy points to running backs, they're also giving up the 2nd fewest receptions and receiving yards to running backs. So that definitely hurts James White. Last week, only the 4 targets after he's led the team in targets all season. Moving down to the other running backs, I'm staying away from Rex. I'm staying away from James Devlin. They're both just, they're not being used enough to be fantasy relevant, but they're being used enough to hurt the relevancy of Sonny Michel and James White. So I think out of the 2, I think you can ride with Sonny. I think you got to sit James White. Looking at the rest of their team here, we got Josh Gordon, 100 yards last week. Julian Edelman caught 9 of his 12 targets for 86 yards and a touchdown. I think you can play both of them. Steelers' pass defense ain't bad, but it ain't great. And then we saw Gronk come back and look like Gronk. Caught 8 of his 8 targets for 100 yards and a touchdown. The Steelers give up the 5th most fantasy points to tight ends. So, if you've been patient enough to sit there with Gronk giving you, mediocre fantasy numbers, you were rewarded last week given he gave you a nice game, and I see him giving you another good game. So I'm going to take a break here. I'm going to go grab another beer, and I'm going to come back, and we're going to do part 2 of this Week 15 edition of the Dudes and Beer Fantasy Football Podcast. Welcome back to the podcast. Welcome back to part 2. We are going to start part 2 here with the Packers and the Bears. As I said earlier, I have Aaron Rodgers in one of my leagues, and I'm sitting him for Lamar Jackson. Last week, he gave us under 200 yards and 2 touchdowns. Yeah, he was able to rush for 44 yards. He did have 3 touchdowns against this Bears defense in their first matchup, but I don't know, man. It's just Aaron Rodgers has not been Aaron Rodgers. He just doesn't look like the dude who I drafted as the first quarterback taken this year in one of my leagues. He just hasn't really produced. I know he's not a top 3 quarterback. He hasn't broken through to Mahomes, Breeze, and Goff numbers, but he is still Aaron Rodgers. So if you have nobody else, if you don't have Lamar Jackson on your bench, I think you can feel okay starting him. Like I said, 3 touchdowns against this team in week 1. But for me, I'm sitting him from Lamar Jackson. The other guy I have in a lot of leagues is Aaron Jones. This isn't a great matchup for him either. Bears give up the second fewest fantasy points to running backs. And last week was weird. He wasn't really used in the first quarter at all. He did finish the game with 20 touches and over 100 total yards with a touchdown. He's just too involved to sit even in a bad matchup, so I'm starting him. And then Devontae Adams, of course, you're starting him as well. Bears pass defense is definitely the weakest point of their defense, but they're not bad at that at all either. But again, Devontae Adams with Aaron Rodgers, you got to start him. He's a top tier wide receiver for sure. The interesting one here is Randall Cobb. So last week we saw him return, caught 5 of his 6 targets for 40 yards and a touchdown. Him and Rodgers have always had a connection for the past few years, no matter what other wide receivers were on the team, whether it's Devontae Adams or Jordy Nelson or Jennings that we saw, or whoever that may be. There's always been a connection there with Randall Cobb. And the first week of the season when they played, Cobb had 9 catches on 10 targets for 142 yards and a touchdown. And the nickel corner for the Bears, Bryce Callahan, is out for this game. So theoretically, that should be an easier matchup for Randall Cobb. I think he's a sneaky play in DFS, and I think in leagues where you're looking at some of the wide receivers you may have on your team that don't have very great matchups, and you see Randall Cobb on the waiver wire. I think it's one of those playoff weeks, wild card type of plays that can win you a week. I don't think he'll kill you. He'll definitely catch a few passes. He'll definitely have 30 to 40 yards. I don't think he'll give you a 0, but that the chance of him repeating his 9 catch 142 yard and a touchdown game in week 1, I think it's an attractive, interesting matchup for sure. For the Bears, I'm staying away from Mitchell Trubisky. Last week threw 3 interceptions, had only 110 yards, did have a touchdown, but he just didn't look right. I think I don't know if he's still hurt or what it is, but I'm staying away from him. The running backs for the Bears, last week we saw Jordan Howard get 20 touches, which is a lot considering how much they used Tariq Cohen. Gave you 100 yards. I think the Bears might want to try and do this again, really try and pound the rock, run the ball, keep Aaron Rodgers on the sideline. I think Jordan Howard's a safe play as an RB2. And then Tariq Cohen, last week was a mediocre week for him. Just under 100 yards on 13 touches, 4 of which were catches on 4 targets. One of his more underused games, I'd say, but still gave you a decent number in PPR. The tight end for the Bears, Trey Burton, has been a huge disappointment all season. The Packers' strength is their defense against tight ends. They give up the second fewest fantasy points to tight ends, so I'm staying away from Trey Burton. And although the Packers give up the 3rd most fantasy points to wide receivers, I have no idea who to play out of this group of 3 of Allen Robinson, to Taylor Gabriel, and Anthony Miller. Beginning of the season, it was all Gabriel. Then in the middle of the season, it was all Miller. And now it seems like it's all Allen Robinson. Anthony Miller didn't catch his 1 target last week. So they're just too inconsistent. It's too much of a coin flip. And as I said, when I'm talking about Randall Cobb, there's too much of a chance that one of these guys is going to give you a complete dud. There is a chance that one of them is going to have an awesome game because of the Packers' stance against wide receivers, but I just don't know which is which, so I'm staying away from those. For Tariq Cohen, last week wasn't all that great, but the Packers allow the 4th fewest receptions and the 8th fewest receiving yards. So, I wouldn't expect too much of a bounce back game here. He will be used in the pass game like he always is, but and I think you can still play him, but I wouldn't expect him to have a massive bounce back game here. Moving on to another NFC North team here, we got the Lions playing at the Bills. The Bills have their awesome defense, and they have this quarterback who's running people over. Josh Allen last week had another 100-yard rushing game with a touchdown. He did fumble, but he also gave you 200 passing yards and had 2 interceptions. So he definitely hurt his numbers with all those turnovers. You look at LaShawn McCoy, he had the 2 attempts, and then he left the game with a hamstring injury. They did apparently sign a guy off their practice squad, which does not look good for McCoy. He hasn't been pronounced out yet, but I'm going to assume that he is out. You look at Chris Ivory, did get 12 carries last week. I expect him to get a little more than that against this Lions run defense that has gotten a lot better since they've added Snacks Harrison, but they are still giving up the 10th most fantasy points to running back. So I expect Chris Ivory to definitely see a big bump in his production. For anybody out there that's been riding with LaShawn McCoy, I think you can count on Chris Ivory as a decent backup unless you have somebody else on your bench that you're willing to play. But then again, if you did, you probably wouldn't have been starting LaShawn McCoy. And then looking at these wide receivers for the Bills, again, I have no idea who's going to do what. Reuben Foster, he'll have a 100-yard game, and then the next game he'll do nothing. Zane Jones, he'll get targeted nine times like he did last week, and then we'll come back and have 2 or 3 targets the next week. So I can't count on any of those players for the Bills at all, except for possibly Chris Ivory this week if LaShawn McCoy is out. And if you're in a league where you're hurting at quarterback, I think you can still get away with Josh Allen. I talk about the floor being raised with Lamar Jackson's rushing. We can't ignore Josh Allen's rushing. He's been lighting it up. Looking at the Lions, it seems Kerryon Johnson is still questionable. He probably won't play. We saw LeGarrette Blount get 12 carries last week, only gave us 33 yards, and I think the Lions just kind of got sick of it and came back in the second half, and they really kind of featured Zach Zenner. Got 12 carries of his own, 54 yards with a touchdown. I don't think this week we'll see them split carries like this, 12-12. I think we're going to see a lot more Zenner than we do LeGarrette Blount. But with that being said, the Lions really have nothing else outside of Kenny Golladay, and the Bills defense is really good. So I'm staying away from all of these Lions, especially Kenny Golladay after that dud that he put out last week. Plus this week he's playing the Bills with Tre'Davious White, so he's probably not going to have very, very good of a game this week either. And we've been saying for the past couple of weeks, Theo Riddick is playable in PPR because he's so involved in the pass game, but 4 catches on 4 targets, it's not enough to me to warrant a start in PPR. I need, when you're only getting 5 to 6 carries a game, I need you more involved in the pass game. I need to see that target number closer to 7 to 8 if I'm going to consider playing you as a receiving upside running back. So I'm staying away from all Lions this week. That Bills defense is very good. Moving on to the Dolphins at the Vikings. The playable guys in this game here, it's pretty much only the Vikings. Kirk Cousins last week looked horrible. He had a fumble, did end the game with 200 yards, but I'm pretty sure half of it was on that final drive. Got saved by that touchdown to Delvin Cook at the end of the game. Quick shout out to my colleague Bill. He told me one of the more horrific fantasy stories I've heard in a while. First week of the playoffs for them last week. He was playing. He got it. He snuck in as a 6th seed. He's playing the number 1 seed. I think he was down. I think he said 3 or 4 points going into Monday Night Football. He had Seattle's defense, who had an interception return for a touchdown, and under 10 points allowed or whatever it was. And also, and he was playing up against Kirk Cousins and Stephon Diggs. So you got a defense going up against a quarterback and a running back, and you're down a few points going into Monday Night Football. You'd think I have zero chance whatsoever, but going into the last drive of the game, he was up 1 point. And of course, the Vikings go down, and Kirk Cousins throws that touchdown, and he finishes the game. I think he said he lost by 3 or 4 points because of that final drive. So the garbage time counts, people. So fantasy, like I said earlier, fantasy points are fantasy points. Every minute counts. It's not just because the Vikings were out of it in real life doesn't mean that that fantasy production doesn't count. So. Not that I think that the Vikings will find themselves behind like they did against the Seahawks this week playing the Dolphins. But as I mentioned in my DFS lineup, I want to play Dalvin Cook. I think he's going to be more involved. I think he's going to get more carries, especially after what they saw from Latavius Murray. He had 3 carries last week. One of them, he got stuffed on 4th and 1 from the Seattle 40-yard line. And then later in the fourth quarter, on a goal line carry from the 2-yard line, he got stuffed again. So I think they're looking at their running game and they're going, we need to get this kid, Dalvin Cook, more involved. He's healthy. He's back. Let's feature him more. We saw Diggs and Thielen both have one of their lower target numbers of the year. Diggs was 6, Thielen was 7. They both gave you 70 yards. Not a good game. The Seahawks really shut down that entire Minnesota offense, except for, of course, that last drive of the game. And then Kyle Rudolph this week, he's got a good matchup against the Dolphins, who give up the 6th most fantasy points to tight ends, but he's just not used. I mean, it really seems like Kirk Cousins, it's either they're running the ball or they're throwing it to either Diggs and Thielen. It's pretty simple for them. It's worked for the most part. So I expect this game to look a lot like that. You know, we're going to see Rudolph with his normal 4 to 5 targets. So I'm staying away from him. And then as far as the Dolphins go, I know Kenyon Drake had that nice touchdown to kind of save his day. But besides that, he had 24 yards or maybe 30 total yards throughout the entire rest of the game. It's not enough for me to trust in the fantasy playoffs. Plus, the Vikings give up the 10th fewest fantasy points to running back. So I'm staying away from all Dolphins. I'm staying away from Kenny Stills, who's been playing better. And last week was really weird. Kenny Stills got 9 targets, caught 8 of them for 135 and a touchdown, and the rest of the team combined only had 10 targets. So, you know, he's being featured for sure. Maybe somebody heard him in that interview where he said, I don't know why they're not targeting anymore. Maybe they said, okay, fine, here, kid, here's 10 targets. But yeah, I'm staying away from all these Dolphins. The Vikings defense has really turned it around. They started off the year pretty bad, but they really turned it around here, and they're playing great. So I'm staying away from all Dolphins players for sure. Next game here is the Titans at the Giants. Both teams coming in off of a division win. The Giants blew out the Redskins. We've seen touchdowns all over the stat sheet here. Eli with 200 yards and 3 touchdowns. You can't start him against this Titans defense. 6th fewest fantasy points allowed, 2 quarterbacks. Saquon Barkley is most definitely a start. He's going to be probably a top 5 pick next year. We saw the Giants play without Odell Beckham last week, and what do you know, 3 different wide receivers catch a touchdown, including this kid, Benny Fowler, who a couple years ago, so I probably shouldn't call him a kid, but a couple years ago when he was on the Broncos with Peyton, I remember at the end of the year, Peyton was being interviewed after a game, and he said that he really thinks Benny Fowler is going to emerge as a big-time player. It never really happened in Denver once Peyton was gone, but now that he's over here on the Giants with Eli, we saw him. It was only a 6-yard catch for a touchdown, but we saw him the week before in the final drive of the game. He had, I think it was 3 or 4 targets and caught 3 of them on the sideline. So he's definitely going to be involved, especially if we don't see Odell play again this week. I think he can play Sterling Shepard if Odell is out, and I think Benny Fowler is an interesting daily fantasy player. He's probably dirt cheap, and this Titans defense, their weakness is wide receivers. They give up the 10th most fantasy points to wide receivers. So I think if Odell is out, I think you can definitely play Sterling, and you might be able to get away with Benny Fowler. Looking at the Titans, obviously after Derrick Henry's 240-yard rushing game and 4 touchdowns, I think anybody who has him on their roster that somehow found a way to advance, whether you started him or not, I think you're probably going to feel pressured to start him no matter what. And this isn't a bad matchup. He's had a touchdown in every game for the past 3 or 4 games now, I think. And the Giants are giving up the 9th most fantasy points to running back. So it's a good matchup. I think you can play him again. I'd stay away from Dion Lewis. Hasn't really been doing much. Only 15 touches last week for about 50 yards. And the Giants are giving up the 7th fewest fantasy points to wide receivers. So Corey Davis last week only caught 2 passes for 21 yards. So I'm staying away from him too. So in this game, it's pretty much just the 2 running backs and possibly Sterling Shepard for me. Looking at this Redskins-Jaguars game, I feel bad for whoever's playing quarterback for this Redskins team. I'm sure the Jaguars have been hearing it all week that they quit, that they gave up. They're probably embarrassed that they let this dude, Derrick Henry, come in a division game on Thursday night, just run all over him. Like I said, 200-something total, 200-something rushing yards. It's just embarrassing. So I think the Jaguars are going to come out with something to prove. I think they were embarrassed last week, and I think they're going to put a whooping on this Redskins team. The Jaguars defense, to me, is another one of these DFS defenses that I would probably roll with if I could. The only offensive player for the Jags I think he can play, really the only offensive player in this whole game I think you can feel comfortable playing is Leonard Fournette. The Redskins, their run defense isn't all that bad. Their weakness is against wide receivers. They give up the 6th most fantasy points to wide receivers, but you can't really count on Dede Westbrook or Dante Moncrief or Keelan Cole here, considering who's starting there at quarterback. So this is one of the quicker games that I'm going to just say start Fournette, and anybody else in that game I'd probably sit. Moving on to the Cowboys at the Colts. Zeke Elliott, as I said, had an awesome game last week. Amari Cooper had an even better game last week. I think you can definitely get away with playing both of them. This Blake Jarwin dude, he's an interesting cat. Caught 7 of his 7 targets for 56 yards last week. Again, if you're one of these guys that's been riding with a waiver wire tight end, or you have a tight end with a bad matchup such as Cameron Brate, I think you can maybe get away with Blake Jarwin this week. 7 targets and you catch every one of them. That gives the coaching staff some confidence that they can count on you the next game, and I think we're going to see him become a little more involved here in this offense, take some pressure off of Amari Cooper for sure, and Zeke Elliott. For the Colts, I'm starting Andrew Luck. He's just been a monster. He's been on fire all season. The Cowboys do have a really good defense here. Really, their only weakness is against tight ends. They give up the 9th most fantasy points to tight ends, so look for a big game from Eric Ebron. But as I said in my DFS lineup, I'm also starting T.Y. Hilton. 200 yards last week, caught 9 of his 12 targets. He's just way too involved to sit no matter what the matchup. Marlon Mack is the tough one for me. The Cowboys give up the 4th fewest fantasy points to running backs, and Marlon Mack has not really been playing very well over the past few weeks. He's still getting his 15 touches, but he only gave us 33 yards last week against the Texans. Did give you a touchdown. He's had a string of pretty tough matchups here. If you can sit him, I'd avoid him. If you can't, I can understand playing him. He's a running back on a team that loves to throw the ball, so you can't really expect too much from him, but we'll see what happens. Moving on to the Battle of the Redbirds, we got the Cardinals playing at the Falcons. Matt Ryan last week had 3 touchdowns and a pick, 260 yards against the Packers. Started off the game, did not aside from the one throw that he made to Julio, didn't really look all that great, but kind of saved himself in the second half. Speaking of Julio, 2 touchdowns last week after, going almost the entirety of the fantasy regular season over these past few weeks. Has turned up his touchdown numbers, gave you 106 yards on 8 catches of 11 targets. Definitely playing him. And looking at this Cardinals defense, they're pretty good. They're in the top 10. They're in the top 8 as far as fewest fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks, wide receivers, and tight ends. Their defense is their running against the running back. It's they find themselves giving up the 3rd most fantasy points to running backs. So Telvin Coleman and Ito Smith haven't really been playing all that great over these past few weeks. But I think if you have one of them, I think you can put them in your flex and feel okay with it in this matchup. For the Cardinals, it's David Johnson and it's Larry Fitzgerald. With Christian Kirk down, Larry Fitzgerald saw his target number hit 9 last week. He only caught 5 of them, but I think we're going to see that same target number be there this week. Falcons, they give up the most fantasy points to quarterbacks and the 7th most to wide receivers. So if you got Fitz, fire him up this week. If you got David Johnson, you're definitely firing him up this week. Targeted 10 times last week, caught 8 of them, and 15 carries. So against this Falcons defense, it gives up the 5th most fantasy points to running back. So he's another good start here. Moving on to the Seahawks at the 49ers. These two teams just played a couple weeks, 2 weeks ago. 3 actually, if you look at it. And you look at the 49ers numbers against the Seahawks in that week 13 or week 14 matchup, whatever it was. Nick Mullins, 414 yards and 2 touchdowns. Wilson came in for Breida, who was hurt, and had he had 23 touches for over 100 total yards. Pettis caught 5 of his 7 targets for 129 yards and 2 touchdowns, and George Kittle was great as always. So it's, you look at the fantasy numbers allowed by this Seahawks team, and they give up the 8th fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks, but yet they're giving up quite a few to wide receivers. So I think Pettis is a good start here. Actually, Pierre Garçon is on IR. We saw Godwin come back. Wasn't really all that used last week, and I think Dante Pettis has kind of emerged as the number 1 wide receiver almost there. Last week only caught 3 of 7 targets for 50 yards against the Broncos, but as I mentioned, his numbers the last time they played the Seahawks, can't really get away from him. You definitely can't get away from George Kittle last week, 210 yards and a touchdown. So you're definitely starting him. And I think Jeff Wilson, if Breida isn't playing, I think he's going to be a real good start. Even if Breida does play, I still think he's going to see 15 to 20 carries. And the Seahawks allow the 2nd most receiving yards to running backs. And as we saw him in that last matchup against the Seahawks, he was targeted 9 times. So I can see him being involved in the pass game a lot, even if Breida is out. So I'm starting Jeff Wilson. I'm starting George Kittle. I'm starting Dante Pettis in this matchup. Russell Wilson coming off of that stinker last week, 72 yards and an interception. He kind of saved himself with a 40-yard run with 4 minutes left in the 4th quarter. Besides that, it was a horrible game, but he's a gamer and he's a winner. He won the game. So I'm starting him against this 49ers team who are giving up the 8th most fantasy points to quarterbacks, as I mentioned. I think you can start Chris Carson. He's getting his 20 carries a game, gave you 90 yards and a touchdown last week against the Vikings. The other 2 running backs here are interesting. I think Rashad Penny has vaulted himself as the number 2. He is, I think, the handcuff to Chris Carson. 8 attempts for 40 yards. Nothing great, but as I said, I think if Carson goes out, we will see Rashad Penny become the number 1 running back there, like we saw in whatever it was, week 5 or 6 that we saw Chris Carson miss. In my in one league that I have Chris Carson, I actually I'm gonna right after this podcast, I'm gonna drop Mike Davis and pick up Rashad Penny, so I have the better handcuff there. And then as far as the wide receivers go, we saw David Moore. He got targeted 5 times, didn't catch any of them. He had a red zone target. He was targeted deep on bombs. Couldn't stay in bounds. He had the 1 or 2 games in a row where he looked really good and then has kind of disappointed us since then. So I think Tyler Lockett is the only wide receiver on the Seahawks that you can safely play here. Jerron Brown, however, did have 2 touchdowns when these 2 teams played a couple weeks ago. So if you're one of those guys that likes to look at division games the second time around and look for dudes who produced well, Jerron Brown did have a pretty nice game there in their previous matchup. So moving on to the Eagles at the Rams. As I mentioned, apparently Carson Wentz will not be playing this game. Apparently it's going to be Nicholas Foles, the Super Bowl MVP from last year. Another guy who's definitely going to miss is Corey Clement. Apparently it could be a multiple week thing where he's out. Maybe might even be done for the season. So it looks like it's going to be Josh Adams and Darren Sproles again. I don't know if I can start either of them. And this was, in the beginning of the season when I said that the Eagles were one of the backfields that I wanted to avoid. We're seeing it right here. Last week, 7 attempts for Adams, 1 attempt for Darren Sproles, 1 attempt for Wendell Smallwood, 1 attempt for Corey Clement. I mean, it just seems like they let everybody touch the ball at least one time on run plays. So I'm staying away from all of them. The Rams, their run defense is not all that great, but I expect the Rams to be up big here, and I don't think the Eagles are really going to have much time to run the ball at all, really. I think they're going to count on Alshon Jeffrey and Zach Ertz, which is why I'm starting both of them. Jeffrey coming off of one of his better games over these past few weeks. He definitely saw the most targets he's seen over the past month. I saw 9 targets, caught 6 of them for 50 yards and a touchdown. I think you can look to one of those games here against the Rams where the Eagles are going to have to throw the ball to keep up. We'll see if Aqib Talib is back and plays throughout the whole game, and if he shadows somebody, we'll have to see if it's going to be Jeffries or Golden Tate. Golden Tate last week had a horrible game, only caught 1 of his 3 targets for 7 yards. It just seems like the Eagles brought this dude in with good intentions, but they just haven't really been able to use him like he had been used with the Lions over the past few years. And as I mentioned, it's hurt Zach Ertz. We only saw him get 8 targets last week, which is a lot less than what he's been averaging all this season. I think he's been averaging in the double digits as far as targets go. So Golden Tate's definitely taken a little bit away from him. And so is Dallas Goedert. He got 5 targets last week, caught 4 of them for 44 yards. One of them would have been a huge run for a touchdown that was called back on, I think, the most horrible call in the game, which is saying a lot considering that opening kickoff that the refs botched there. And that's not me being an Eagles homer. I'm a Jets fan. I'm just calling it like it is. The Eagles definitely got hosed in that game. I feel bad for my Eagle fan brethren here, or that aren't here with me. Looking at the Rams, I mean, Jared Goff has to play better than he played last week. He threw the ball 44 times, only gave you 180 yards, 4 interceptions. By far the worst game of his of the season here. Same thing with Gurley, 58 total yards, worst game of the year for him as well. But Robert Woods, he had 13 targets, caught 7 of them for 61 yards. He's been the most consistent wide receiver for the Rams this year. Throughout the injuries and throughout, different personnel being used and, whatnot. So I'm definitely starting Robert Woods. I'm starting Brandon Cooks. You can't get away from Goff and Gurley even after their bad games. And then the other guy that I'm willing to take a week 15 gamble on is Josh Reynolds. Yeah, last week didn't play well. Was targeted 7 times, though, and as I mentioned earlier, this Eagles pass defense is really bad. 2nd most fantasy points to wide receivers, 9th most to quarterbacks. So I think you can plug in Josh Reynolds, and that touchdown upside for him is definitely there. So that will do it for the Eagles-Rams game, and we are down to the last game of the preview here. We got the Saints playing the Panthers in NFC South matchup. Saints coming off of that comeback win against the Buccaneers. Who would have saw that? And the Panthers lost another one to the Browns. I think Cam Newton's not right. I think he's still hurt. He did not look good. Threw an interception. He did run for 23 yards, and the Saints allow the 7th most rushing yards to quarterbacks. But as I said, Cam just doesn't look right. I think, most people probably don't have another quarterback. If you have Cam, you've probably been riding him for these past couple weeks as he's had all these good matchups in a row. Saints give up the 3rd most fantasy points to quarterbacks, so I'm sure there's going to be plenty of people out there that feel the need that you have to start Cam Newton, and I don't know if there's really a waiver wire quarterback that you can really trust to replace Cam Newton. You kind of just have to hope he goes out there and gives you something in the running game if his shoulder or back or whatever it is still hurt. The one guy in the Panthers that you never have to worry about taking out of your starting lineup is Christian McCaffrey. 16 carries, gave you only 63 yards, but 2 touchdowns. He also caught 6 to 7 targets for 38 yards. It's weird, like you almost expect McCaffrey to have 100 yards receiving and rushing every single game. It seems like he does it every week. But he definitely paid you off with those 2 touchdowns. And then the other 2 guys on the Panthers that I'm starting is Curtis Samuel and DJ Moore. It seems like Devin Funchess has been almost completely phased out of the offense. He got 3 targets but didn't catch any of them. And we did see Ian Thomas come in, backup tight end, after Greg Olsen went down for the year. He got targeted 11 times, caught 9 of them for 77 yards. If the Panthers do decide to move on from Greg Olsen, I think Ian Thomas could be a sleeper tight end going into the season next year that you can probably get with one of your last picks. Unless the hype gets blown up too much about him, but he should be a pretty good player next year for them at tight end. I'm not starting him this week, however. The Saints do give up the 5th fewest fantasy points to tight ends, one of their strengths. So I'm staying away from him this week. But like I said, going into next season, I think he could be an interesting name to keep track of. Drew Brees last week didn't have a great game, 200 yards and a touchdown with a pick, but the Panthers giving up the 7th most fantasy points to quarterbacks, so Brees has a good matchup here. You're definitely going to start him if you have him. Both of these running backs you're going to start. Michael Thomas came back after, over this past month of average, getting maybe 5 to 6 targets a game. We saw the Saints say, screw this. We need to refocus here and get the ball to Michael Thomas like we have, and caught 11 of his 13 targets for 100 yards. So that was great to see for being a Michael Thomas owner in a few leagues. I'm really happy that they were able to, get him back involved. And then, so you're starting him this week. And then you have Ben Watson, who has a great matchup here. The Panthers have been one of the worst teams against tight ends all season. They give up the 3rd most fantasy points to tight ends. So I think he's one of those waiver wire tight ends that you can take a shot on. Also, Dan Arnold, their undrafted tight end that they got, I think he's worth a shot, honestly, too, just because of the matchup. The Panthers are atrocious against tight ends. So that is going to do it for the Week 15 preview episode of the Dudes and Beer Fantasy Football Podcast. Thank you for tuning in. Next week, I'll hopefully have somebody else here with me that we can discuss the last week of the fantasy playoffs and the fantasy season. So good luck, and may the fantasy gods be cruel to your opponent.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Dudes and Beer Fantasy Football Podcast. To listen to our episodes or chat with us live, download the official Dudes and Beer app, available on Android and iDevices, or visit us online at dudesandbeer.com. You can also find all of our episodes on Breach.tv, iHeartRadio, Spreaker, SoundCloud, or your favorite podcast service. Dudes and Beer is a proud member of the HC Universal family of podcasts. For more about our sponsors, podcasts, and other content, visit hcuniversalnetwork.com or download the free HC Universal Network app. Thanks for listening, everybody. And until next time, drink responsibly.